So what's really behind these Middle East wars? Because they don't make any sense. Remember before at this outset, though, I said that there's a plan to make Jerusalem the capital of the world government? If you go to Global Research, there's a really good article there called Greater Israel, the Zionist Plan for the Middle East, and it talks about the Oded Yinon plan. And that is an internal policy of the Israeli government to destabilize and fragmentize all of their neighbors. If you're looking at a crime as a police detective, like 9/11 was a crime, usually when you look at a crime, one of the first questions you ask is, if you're looking at the guilty party, who benefited? Now, the Middle East Muslims didn't benefit from 9/11 because we bombed them into total chaos. America didn't benefit from 9/11 because we spent trillions on wars. We've lost thousands of soldiers' lives, and we've got an encroaching police state here in America. The only beneficiary was actually Israel, which has watched the U.S. military dismantle its enemies one by one. Now, this man here is Alan Sabrowski. He, like me, is partly of Jewish descent. He's a retired Marine officer, former director of studies at the United States Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute, a position he held for several years. And I'll give you a quote from him. Quote, I've had long conversations over the last 2 weeks with contacts at the Army War College at the headquarters Marine Corps, and I've made it absolutely clear in both cases that it is 100% certain that 9/11 was a Mossad operation. And by the way, that's not an isolated quote. He said that many times. So what are these Mossad connections? Again, the Mossad is the Israeli intelligence service. Well, on 9/11, major news networks reported that a group of men had been spotted celebrating the attacks. They were photographing the Twin Towers. They were celebrating. They were high-fiving each other. They were filming themselves against the burning backdrop of the buildings. And they climbed into a van, and neighbors wrote down the license number, and they were caught by the police. This is all on CNN. But then the mainstream media just dropped the story. CNN never, to my knowledge, never said another word about it. Well, who were these men? They were actually Israelis. Two of them were Mossad, working for the Mossad, and one of them had a visitor's pass for the World Trade Center. They failed their lie detector tests. They already had their cameras set up at 8 o'clock in the morning when the planes were still on the runway at Logan. Nonetheless, after 2 weeks, the FBI halted their investigation of them, and after 2 months, they were allowed to go back to Israel along with dozens of other Israelis who'd been arrested in the wake of 9/11. Why was that? Because the man in charge of the 9/11 investigation for the Justice Department was Michael Chertoff, whose mother was a founding officer of Mossad. And Philip Zelikow, who headed the 9/11 Commission, is actually a dual Israeli citizen. Why in the world would somebody with citizenship in a foreign country be allowed to run the 9/11 Commission? Larry Silverstein took over ownership of the World Trade Center less than 2 months before the attacks. Now, he invested $124 million, and he got an insurance payout of over $4.5 billion. I think that's a very good return on a 2-month investment. Now, according to the New York Times, Silverstein always had breakfast every morning in the North Tower at the restaurant called Windows on the World. But wouldn't you know it, on 9/11, he had a lucky dermatologist appointment. Now, Silverstein was so close to Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu that Netanyahu called him every week, and I just want to quote the Israeli newspaper Haaretz on that. Quote, every Sunday afternoon, New York Times, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference what the subject was or where Netanyahu was. He would always call up Haaretz, November 21st, 2001. Notice it's Netanyahu calling Silverstein, not the other way around. Now, security at all 3 involved airports in 9/11 was run by ICTS. ICTS, a private firm owned by Israelis. Now, the judge put in charge of handling litigation for the 9/11 victims' families was Alvin K. Hellerstein. Many of the families wanted to sue ICTS and sue the government. They wanted this thing to be handled in a courtroom. However, all of the families were forced to settle out of court by Judge Hellerstein. So he let ICTS off the hook, but his son worked in Israel as a lawyer for the company that represents ICTS, meaning Hellerstein had a clear conflict of interest. Only to scratch the surface here, but if you'd like to read more about this, I recommend Christopher Berlin's excellent book, Solving 9/11. And if you want to read something more quick, Wikispooks has an excellent post online called 9/11 Israel Did It. I want to close with one final clip. This is, let me just identify this guy. This is Patrick Clausen, Director of Research for the Washington Institute for Near Eastern Policy.
I think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition. Of, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
All right. So you may have noticed that this guy is saying the same thing I've been saying all through this talk, except that he digs this stuff and he thinks we should use the same type of measures to start a war with Iran, which you may recall was the last country on the hit list that General Wesley Clark mentioned. Well, the oligarchs are into a lot more than just war. They're into everything from population control to central banking, and I've written a couple of books. I wrote a book in 2013 called Truth is a Lonely Warrior, which is a primer on this whole New World Order, A to Z. I just released this month a new book called 13 Pieces of the Jigsaw. Blog posts I've written since then, some of the more significant ones that fill in some of the holes, expands upon many of the details that we've talked about today. So anyway, that completes my presentation. I want to thank Boston 9/11 Truth for hosting this event. You can find more information on our website, jamesperloff.com. That does complete the presentation, and I know that Mike Carey is going to lead any questions or comments that people may have.